Great. Hey guys, how's everybody doing? Good to be here today. We're going to talk about how the endpoint is evolving. MSPs have been managing endpoints as long as there's been managed services. The thing is the definition of what an endpoint is evolving into something that people are starting to now call digital workspaces. So let's kind of walk through what that's about for a minute and see where we go. All right. So there's our title. Digital workspaces are the next big opportunity for MSPs. So let's define what a digital workspace is. It's really the concept that the experience that you have in the office today with your applications when you walk in is going to be replicated in a virtual environment that you can take anywhere. So it'll show up on your mobile device. You can use it at home. The challenge is that most of these experiences that people have today are a mess. Occasionally you see a well-run company where there's an end user portal, the applications are tightly presented, end users kind of understand what the workflow is across these things. But for the most part, what people experience today on the endpoint is, to use a New England phrase, I guess, a mishigash of applications that are presented to them. And then they are expected to remember their logins, to log into each one, use them, and hopefully they are copying and pasting the right data between applications, and maybe something that feels like a process works out. But the user interface is always different. The experience is always different between, say, shifting from Microsoft Office to Zoom to Salesforce. And we're never really going to get anywhere unless we start to unify all this stuff and create something that feels more like a digital workspace that is what I'm going to argue the new endpoint. And so what we're trying to do here is integrate a lot of technologies such as email, instant messaging in the form of what is now Slack, all these different SaaS applications, collaboration tools might be Box or whatever else you have out there. Each one of these gets layered in and creates yet another communications barrier that people are trying to overcome. In fact, I would argue sometimes it's a wonder that anything gets done there because people are now monitoring email and instant messaging and all these other things alongside each other. Each SaaS application has its own little communications vehicle inside it as well. And no one seems to remember exactly who did what, when, and where, or what the handoffs are supposed to be. And yet we keep throwing around this phrase digital business transformation. I think a lot of people just nod their head and they think that, if they see it someday, they might know what that is. But making that happen is a lot harder than anybody actually appreciates. Layer that in on top of that is this whole notion of these new no code and low code tools that people are using. You can go into each individual SaaS application and they'll present you some tools that you can use to customize that experience. Most end users can't resist the temptation to go do that, right? Somebody goes, oh, I got some cool little thing we can do with this tool, and he shares it with everybody else. The problem is that my little thing that I did using the tool that came with Salesforce doesn't really work across all the other applications. So you're starting to see people move to these independent platforms that come from companies like Mendix and OutSystems to build something that's a little more elaborate, a little more custom, that's unique for that business, that hopefully allows them to differentiate themselves either by automating some process faster or maybe even creating some new stream of revenue for an end customer because they created some app that ties into their CRM as well as Slack and into their e-commerce engine, and they did something pretty elaborate. Granted, you have to be a pretty high-end IT organization to pull all that off these days. And what I'm arguing is that that's starting to move downstream, and it's going to be MSPs that bring that to the broader portfolio of folks that are out there. Now, there's a lot of market research out there on this topic, and I won't bore you with the growth rates for each of these because you can read as well as I can. But I'll also even go so far as to say I'm not a huge believer in research numbers that come in from all these different companies. Let's just say that it's going to be a Carl Sagan's kind of billions upon billions of dollars worth of market over the next few years. And the question is this going to be driven by internal IT organizations, or is it more likely to be driven as a service from somebody who has the expertise to pull that together? And I'm thinking it's going to be much more of a service because it is a little complex to pull off. and it adds value in a way that the internal IT team might not be able to do on their own, especially in that mid-market SMB sector. So what are the drivers for this? Well, what we have seen is this massive shift to SaaS applications in the wake of the COVID pandemic. What people are doing is saying, hey, we're all working from home, logging in remotely to the legacy Windows application that sat on a LAN is not a satisfying experience. So they're going, hey, let's accelerate this shift to the cloud. I know everybody talks about the cloud like we're going to move a workload to Amazon, and that does happen, but the majority of it is people are swapping out legacy applications for SaaS applications, and they keep adding new ones on top of that. I don't think we're going back to the office in any way that we used to go back to the office. We will eventually go back to the office, but I don't think that that's going to happen where we're going to return to these legacy Windows applications that we had. Whatever SaaS applications people adopt now, they're going to continue to use, and they're going to float in between their home and their office to do that. And again, each one of these things is going to wind up being customized. So essentially, we're going to have these workflows that are moving between these different applications, and each business is going to try to create something that is unique to them, that makes them more efficient, but they may not have the expertise to do that, right? Because they're only in their own little bucket. What I'm arguing is that MSPs will see these optimizations and these workflows across multiple applications and even multiple sectors, and they'll be able to capture that intellectual property and then go back to their customers and say, hey, we created this interesting workflow that's highly reusable, that addresses this common problem, and we will deliver this to you as a service, or you might even sell it as an application on top of your service, or something that adds some differentiated value for that MSP. Return to the office is also going to get complicated because we don't know how many people are returning to that office. A lot of people are saying, well, we may need to have social distancing, so we may only have a certain number of people in the office at a given time. Other people are saying, well, we're going to take small groups and move them out into remote offices because we don't want to have so many people at risk at the same time. Right? We send everybody into a large office somewhere in LA or New York, and somebody gets COVID, then the whole office needs to get tested. If we can have smaller groups of people working in suburbs, the risk might be lower and they can work out of these smaller offices. And then finally, a lot of people are saying we may not need the office altogether. The new remote office is all these different home offices that people have because they're saying, hey, the cost of real estate is not useful to the business. It doesn't seem to be impacting productivity to have everybody working from home. And they may decide not to have an office altogether, but that has huge implications for the performance of their applications. Finally, I would argue with the downturn coming from the pandemic, we're going to see a lot more emphasis on productivity. Every time we do see a downturn, the same conversation comes up. We need people to do more with less. That means we need to give them a better, more efficient application experience to make that happen. Otherwise, we keep throwing all these tools at them and things get more complicated and productivity drops. And then people start coming back in and saying, we need to hire more people. And yet the business isn't growing to support that. And the friction inside that business and the tension starts to increase. And people go, hey, there's just got to be a better way. And finally, even in a down market, the war for talent is still on. People want the best people, and the best people are only going to work for a place that gives them the best application experience. Not going to tolerate going into an office and having to navigate all this stuff and dealing with all this stress. If I have the talent, I'm going to go where the people of the best skills and the best IT experience are going to be. It kind of factors into my analysis of whether I want to work for somebody. It's not just how much I make. Is what is the daily experience like? What's the grind like? Can I work from home? Can I adjust my lifestyle around it? Will the company adjust to me versus always forcing me to adjust to the company? And if that's the case, then you're going to find companies will say, yes, we know, we think that we're in charge of the marketplace because the economy is down and people will tolerate more stuff. But the best people still come back and say, hey, you got to make this work for me because I've got a life, I've got a family, there's lots going on, and we're not working 9 to 5 anymore. We're working on these global business accounts. And yeah, I don't know about you, but I got phone calls into the evening. So in the middle of the afternoon, I might go play golf to make up for that switch and that balance and that mix. So it's not as simple as it used to be by any stretch. All right, so how is this going to happen? Well, I would argue that today, a big part of the problem we're seeing is that people are working from home, dialing in over a VPN over some sort of network controlled by their local carrier. And then that takes them into a remote office using a VPN. And then from the remote office, there's a router that's taking them back into the data center, which then in turn is determining whether or not that traffic flow needs to go to an application in that data center, or does it have to go out to some cloud application? And what you wind up with is a backhaul effect, where we're backhauling all this traffic through the network. And then when people are working at home, it was bad enough when people were working in the office, never mind when they're working at home. We kind of extended this whole latency conversation, it gets even worse. And the truth of the matter is that even in a remote office in New York is going to have a better internet experience than a remote office might have in, not picking on anybody, but let's just say Alabama, where somebody's in a smaller town and the bandwidth just isn't as rich or as diverse, and that has a negative impact on everything from their experience in the office to their experience working from home, and the frustration levels get high. So I think what people are going to wind up doing is re-architecting their networks. And the first thing that they're going to come to is the SD-WAN as a replacement for that router in the local office. Fact of the matter is, VPN tunnels are just too difficult to manage for a lot of organizations. They're costly, they're expensive. I got to manage the servers to make all that happen. It becomes a lot simpler just to consume SD-WANs and that whole thing as a service delivered as an MSP than it is for me to go around and figure out where all the appliances are supposed to be, who's going to manage that, and update them accordingly. VPNs don't tend to scale all that well either. The experience winds up being determinant on how many users are using it at the same time and how many people are logging into that. And as we can all see, if the entire company is now remote, it has a high probability that everybody's going to log in at the same time or try to do the same application at the same time. And it's going to hang because of these latency issues. And there's just going to be lots and lots of frustration. So when you put it all together, you want to also think through what are the licensing costs for all these different VPNs that are out there. Some people might use an open source VPN, but most people are relying on commercial software. Yeah, everybody got a break during COVID because they were firing up licenses, and so they got a good deal from their VPN provider as an emergency. But now people are starting to say, hey, what is your actual usage of these licenses and what is that going to cost? And as that cost goes up, starts to become more interesting to think about consuming networking as a service. We have some leaders in virtual desktop today, right? We see VMware and Citrix driving this conversation. There's a couple other startups in the space as well. And so it's not necessarily a brand new idea. The question is how to do it at scale. And then again, I come back to the answer to that question is going to be a managed service provider. Microsoft and Google are also moving this way. We're starting to see them consolidate various applications in the SaaS space. They're maybe not as unified as everybody might like today, but I think, as we kind of look down the path, it's not too long before Microsoft and Google start talking about digital workspaces themselves and they start to unify their portfolio. Not sure that everybody wants to keep buying individual licenses for each individual application. I think that at some point they want to say, hey, what's the total cost of my application experience from one of these vendors? And then they want to figure out how to unify that and come at that with one simple bill that's maybe driven by the number of end users they have. I know that might not be in the interest of Microsoft and Google right now, but I think ultimately the customers are going to push back and say, hey guys, I can't figure out who's paying for what and what it's costing me, and I have no way to predict my costs, and this is driving me crazy. And the other thing to think through here, though, is so VMware, Citrix, and some of these other guys are trying to bundle an SD-WAN in with their digital workspaces. I would argue that maybe that's not the way to go, because What happens is that end customers don't want to get locked into a specific digital workspace, or for that matter, an SD-WAN from a particular vendor. They want to be able to also think about what is the flexibility they want to have on both ends of that equation. The digital workspace needs to evolve quickly. It needs to be customizable. Somebody has to manage that for them on that part. It'll be up to you guys to decide. Some of you may decide, we'll just go with the VMware or the Citrix or whatever other digital workspace engine is out there and customize that. Others of you are going to decide, we'll build that portal ourselves because we want it to be more flexible and we may not want to share the licensing fees back with those guys. Again, it's up to you guys. Figure out what your own business model and what makes the most amount of sense. And some of that will come down to how much engineering talent you have. I would also point out here, though, most of these SD-WAN control planes are going to be in the cloud. Barracuda, as you've seen, has some survey out there that says 52% of respondents expect to be driving that up into the cloud. And I think the nature of the way we manage those experiences is going to be slightly different. I think there's plenty of people out there that want an MSP to manage the whole thing end to end. But I also think there's a lot of people now talking about how they want to co-manage the networking experience with the MSP. And what they want is up in the cloud. And then there's a portal somewhere up there that they can log into and give access to specific users and not have every request go through an MSP. Again, up to you guys, business models, figure out what you want to do and how much control you want to share or not share. But a lot of customers are saying, hey, I'm okay with you guys running the underlying network, but I still need to control more of the end users for compliance reasons or whatever else it is. And I don't need every request to go through an MSP per se. Finally, Microsoft Azure shows up as the most preferred cloud platform for deploying these SD-WANs. I think part of that has to do with their application portfolio, pulls people along in that same route. And I think a lot of people are saying, hey, if I'm going to have Office 365, then it makes sense to drive the SD-WAN through that. And of course, Barracuda is delivering a lot of its network and security services around the SD-WAN through that platform. So as partners, you guys all know about that more than I do probably. But you know, it's something to consider and think about how you want to move forward in this regard. What I'm really getting at is you can't really buy a turnkey digital experience. So I think each partner is going to have to figure out to what degree can they create a fabric or something that feels like a portal or a digital workspace that's customizable for each one of their clients, but is not so unique that the cost of building that thing winds up being more than the money they're going to make from delivering it. So you have to think through the process of what elements of this thing are going to be customized and what elements are going to be core technologies that you're going to incorporate and maybe not exposed by brand name to the end client, but you don't need to reinvent the wheel. If there's a lot of capabilities that are already out there, by all means, incorporate them. It's just a question of what's the licensing fee for that versus what it might be for you to do it yourself. And what are the challenges with scale and how much integration experience do you have? Also remember that these application environments are going to continuously evolve. We have seen a tendency where end customers like to rip and replace SaaS apps pretty quickly, or they decide that maybe not everybody in the organization is using that to the full extent that we thought. So they'll sign on for a year-long contract, but after that, they're on to something else. The cost of switching SaaS applications is still high, but it's a lot less than it used to be. And a lot of people are starting to think about these applications that they're using as a little more disposable, shall we say. And if that's the case, you're going to be looking for digital workspaces that give them maximum amount of flexibility. And that flexibility also ties into their digital business transformation strategies. What used to be this kind of nascent idea of how we're going to transform has become the new business continuity plan. A lot of these projects that were gleams in somebody's eye are now being accelerated. A lot of them are, how do we put together some sort of meaningful experience that spans not just their employees, but their end customers and their partners. But the end customers change and the partners change. So how can I build something that is a massive amount of flexibility as the application portfolio change? This is going to take a little extra work, but that's how MSPs can add value. So that's why I'm kind of saying now is the time to start thinking about how to build this stuff. MSPs need to figure out to what degree can they deliver on this promise, and to what degree do they need to actually buy every little component or customize it themselves, and what are the components that are going to make this thing up. I think a lot of times if you research this, you're going to find that there are plenty of services out there in Azure and plenty of services available from vendors such as Barracuda that feed into this digital workspace, but then you can customize and extend that. And you don't need to put your engineering guys on supporting every little aspect of this if you can lean back on either a vendor or in some cases a distributor who's got an engineering team that may specialize in a particular space. But a lot of this stuff is what's on the back end that I can maybe use from a vendor, and then what's on the front end that I can customize to create a better experience for my end customer. And what the end customer always remembers is the front end experience. Most end customers don't even remember what was on the back end, and I don't even think half the time they care. Digital workspaces therefore need to dramatically evolve. I think part of this issue is you guys are going to have to go do some missionary work to the end customer to explain to them what can happen. I think if you ask them in an open-ended conversation, they'd say, you know, I ideally would like this kind of application experience. And then when you put a name on it and call it a digital workspace, they'll be like, yeah, that's it. Show me how to go do that, or why don't you do that for us? And that's kind of critical because now you're the one who is solving the pain point. You know, you're basically going into the customer and saying, tell me where it hurts, and then you can identify the thing that's painful. And then that makes you the most powerful person in the room, I would argue. Internal IT teams, I would also argue, most often don't have the skills to go do this kind of thing. I think that they would aspire to do it. I think if I'm working at a Fortune 500 company, I think that team can do it. I just don't think that the average IT team working for your average SMB mid-market company is really going to have these skills anytime soon. I also don't think that they know enough about the business per se, and I think MSPs have an advantage in this one regard. If you have 10 customers in the same vertical, you have a lot more insight into what's going on in that business than a lot of the internal IT guys do, who only sit in their chair and see one thing every day, and they don't really understand half the time how IT is being applied, or sometimes weren't even involved in the decision to use what technology. They're basically just supporting it. Like I said, MSPs have the skills and they have the experience. They may not have all the skills right now, but it's time to think about what skills are you going to need in this brave new world we're all allegedly moving toward. In my experience, we have never gone back. So this notion that somehow or other when this whole pandemic passes that we're all just going to go back to the way things were, when has that ever happened? I cannot think of a single time when there's been a major change when anybody just said, oh, well, that was nice, but let's just go back to something different. So the challenge is on the MSPs now to say, hey, not how we go back, but how do we go forward? How do we think about what the next thing is going to be and what that looks like, and how does it adjust to the way people need to work, and what skills, therefore, do I need on my bench to go make that happen? Employees will also need training in this brave new world, so don't forget about this opportunity. If you're defining the digital workspaces and creating the workflows, you're the ones who are going to have the knowledge of how the process works. So there's an opportunity once all this stuff gets created to show up and also train these employees. So the add-on revenue from training and other services should be substantial. You know, you have to be careful how you price things as always, but I think that one of the things about this whole digital workspace that to me is going to be interesting is I think it's going to be a gift that keeps on giving over time. And it's got a lot of downstream potential as you start to manage that, because every time the new employee gets onboarded, somebody's got to train them. I think that a lot of companies would say, hey, I think we could outsource that to the MSP who built the workflow in the first place. Just saying. Factors MSP needs to consider. So we discussed to what degree to build or buy. I think everybody gets that idea, but it's tempting to build. A lot of MSPs have engineering talent, and they throw that engineering talent at things to reduce costs. You see that in IT organizations all the time. They'll go out there and start throwing guys at open source projects rather than build a commercial license. But when you take the analysis of all of that, you wind up with a situation where the cost of supporting something far exceeds the revenue that you're generating from it. So you have to think through, where are you going to put your guys, to what talent, and where can they add differentiated value? There's a lot of back-end stuff that I would argue is undifferentiated value that people are spending way too much time on. Part of the skills you're going to need are cloud-native microservices skills. In addition to these low-code tools, you need to understand things like APIs and how different applications are going to be brought together. There's going to be all these different connectors. Some of this stuff is going to be written in containers like Docker. Is probably the great new application wave that makes things easier to deploy. It's also more complex to manage, so there's a bit of a trade-off there. You're going to have to put the management framework in place to start managing these next generation cloud native microservices that are going to make up the digital workspace. I would argue that applications are starting to de-evolve into more core services. Yes, I may license the entire thing from a particular vendor, but when I start peeling it apart, it's not this monolithic entity it used to be. It's a bunch of little microservices that are stitched together that gives me a lot of flexibility in terms of how I want things to work and what can connect to what. For example, there's no reason why today, if you put a file into Box, that it can't show up in Salesforce.com as something you can call directly from that application experience. Requires a little extra work on the API side in terms of making Box talk to Salesforce, but for a lot of end users, that's magic. For an MSP, that could just be an everyday experience in the office. Who's going to secure the digital workspace? This is a significant issue that goes beyond just the firewalls, right? It goes into who's going to make sure that people aren't being phished, who's going to make sure that we're complying with things, all kinds of services that got wrapped around owning the digital workspace. In many cases, it's kind of the same security conversation you're having with the endpoint today, but it's at a higher level. So instead of just securing the network, you're going to have to secure the entire application stack all the way up through layer 7. That creates an interesting possibility in terms of, hey, what are we doing for digital workspace security is really application security. And most of the MSPs that I know today are more focused on networking security, but there's now an opportunity to meld those two things at a higher level, at least I think, as this comes together. But we'll see how that works out, but I'm pretty sure that that's all going to converge. Do you have a strategic partnership with your end customers? This is a pet peeve of mine. Too many partners I run into say, we are the technology advisor to our end customer. End customers don't want advice. They want a strategic partnership. They want somebody that they can lean on that's going to know that they're going to deliver IT services to them that are reliable, that understand their business, and will take them to the next level. The advice they want is what to do next. They don't really want your advice about, let's go buy and get another switch, or we need a better server. They want to understand how technology is going to transform the way their business operates. That's not being an advisor, that's a strategic partner. And you got to get in there and have a conversation at the highest level of your customers and say, hey, we're here to take your business to the next level. It's not about, we're here to make IT more efficient, because ultimately you keep doing that, you're going to wind up in a pricing game, and then you'll drive yourself out of business because the next guy down the road is just going to offer something at a lower price. I have to have a much better relationship. I have to be their most trusted IT partner, not just some advisor, because there's lots of advisors in the world. I got to own the relationship. And then price the service to value. There's always a tendency we have seen in the past where, especially when it comes to endpoints, everybody drops their pants on pricing for the endpoint because they view it as a commodity. Don't treat this as a commodity. It's an opportunity to take the whole conversation and up-level it to the point where I can now price based on my value to the business per se. What is the value of a digital workspace and all its components? You can negotiate that with each individual customer because it will vary widely, and then your margins. But what you won't have happen is a bunch of guys calling around to see what the best price point is for running AV software on an endpoint. because that business is just going to, we've all seen it. It just goes to the floor immediately. So here's what I'm kind of pushing on. Abstractions are everything. If you look at what an operating system is, or a virtual machine is, or even the newfangled Kubernetes clusters, they're abstractions of IT. And what I'm arguing for here is that it's time to move to the next level of abstraction. This level of abstraction is going to be called the digital workspace. It's going to be unique for each individual customer, but it's going to have enough core components that you can build a service around and a practice around it. And so what I'm saying to everybody is you need to drive the next level of abstraction for each of your customers and step in there and own that, as opposed to constantly presenting them with a bunch of isolated services and a mess of stuff that they don't really know how to work, and then they get all antsy about what's the value of IT. Take them by the hand and take them forward, because I think that MSPs that do this will write their own ticket for the next 10 years. All right, guys, that's my sermon for the day. Fire away if you got any questions, but that's what's on my mind these days, and I hope some of you are seeing the same thing.
Awesome, thank you. So we did get a couple questions, but please feel free to anyone who's on the line, please feel free to write questions in either the chat and Q&A, and I will ask Mike live right now. But just to kind of ask you a couple questions that came in through the presentation, there was one thing that you mentioned kind of towards the beginning, that there has been a huge shift to SaaS applications. So the question is, what are some of the applications that an MSP should already support that is kind of new with this whole COVID life, that if they're not supporting now, they're kind of already behind?
Yeah, I think they're the fundamental productivity apps you've always seen. They're the basic Microsoft Office apps, they're CRM apps, there's collaboration applications from Boxware or Google Drive or something of that nature. I don't think there's a brand new SaaS application out there. I think basically people are just finding that they're more accessible in the cloud. There might be a handful of new applications that have taken off, but Zoom was around before the pandemic. It's just that what we're seeing is a massive acceleration.
Awesome, got it. And then the next question is, how should MSPs bundle their services to now include SD-WAN without scaring off their end users? I know that's something you kind of mentioned when you were talking about that, but could you just like elaborate on a little bit more of how an MSP should be looking to bundle?
I think there's no magic algorithm somewhere that says this is the right price point for. I think it will vary by customer. I think it will also vary by service. So, and I would also shy away from having or leading with a pricing conversation at all, because I think that's what scares the customer. I think what you want to do is paint a picture that says, here's the new application experience, what's that worth to you, and then sell that. And then all the other technologies are enabling behind that. So you need to figure out what's the total cost for doing that, and then figuring out what percentage of your customers are going to be able to afford that. Remember, that price point is going to come down over time in terms of cost to you. So not all your customers are going to be able to afford moving to an SD-WAN tomorrow, especially in this economy. So you need to figure out what percentage of them are going to make that switch, then figure out what's the price point. And then over time, you may decide that some of your customers maybe, aren't worth keeping. I know that's a difficult conversation for some folks, but some customers are just, you're not making enough margin on it. So you're spending a massive amount of time and effort on a large number of customers that you might more profitably spend on a smaller number of customers. You guys need to balance that out. But I would argue that there's a tendency to lean on too many customers when many of those customers are, frankly, just more trouble than they're worth.
Great. And then I have one last question that came in. So this, and it's kind of funny, you kind of allude to this a little bit on your previous answer, but how would an MSP position their value to an end client, and why partnering with them as a strategic partner and deliver these services to support a remote workforce? How would someone demonstrate that value up front? Like, what are some tips that you have?
That's an interesting question to demo up front. I think in a digital world today, MSPs should walk this talk. I think they have the ability to say, hey, we can create our own digital workspace for ourselves. We have the capabilities and the tools. And then that becomes the demo that you're showing other customers. Because to your point, one of the challenges here is like digital workspaces is one of those things when you see or you know it when you see it, right? It's a lot like things in life, especially with IT. People want to be able to kind of go, oh, I get that. Yeah, that is so much better. I think that what people put up with today is because we've conditioned them to expect this kind of suboptimal application experience because the IT guys, especially in the internal squads, have been telling them for years, this is as good as it gets. I think that it's pretty clear that it can get a lot better, but maybe, one thing to do is either set it up yourself, go find a distributor with a lab and get them to set it up for you and make them be the guinea pig for the whole thing to figure out what's going to work over there, or go work with Amazon or one of the cloud service providers who I'm pretty sure are anxious to help you set up any kind of proof of concept you want. But I don't think that you need to necessarily bear the total cost for presenting the concept and the idea. I think you can offload that to many partners out there that are happy to do it.
Well, great. Those are all the questions that came in. So with that, I just want to thank you again so much for your time and everyone else's time on the call today. I know myself and the whole Barracuda team really appreciate you jumping on and describing this. And definitely I would encourage everyone on the call to check out Smarter MSP. Mike Vizard writes a lot of great articles. I just saw one on the homepage by you today. So I definitely recommend everyone go visit Smarter MSP and go check out some of his other blog posts. But thank you so much, Mike. And do you have anything else that you wanted to add at the end?
No, I would just say, guys, if it happened before COVID, forget about it. It's time to move on. Time to move on and just take us to a whole new space because people don't want to go back. Hey,
Awesome.
good luck and good selling.
All right, awesome. Well, I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, and I'll give you some time back on your calendars. Have a good one.